Have you ever wondered why, despite working harder than previous generations, you feel more exhausted, more anxious, and more uncertain about your future than ever before? Why is it that in the wealthiest society in human history, rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide continue to climb? Why does every personal struggle you face feel like a moral failing, a character defect, or a sign that you're simply not trying hard enough? Here's what I'm going to reveal to you today. This isn't an accident. This isn't a coincidence. This is the result of a carefully constructed system that has spent decades teaching you to look inward for solutions to problems that are fundamentally external, structural, and systemic. This is the legacy of an economic philosophy that promised freedom but delivered a prison of perpetual self-blame. The evidence is overwhelming. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, anxiety disorders affect 40 million adults annually, with depression affecting over 17 million. The American Psychological Association reports that 76% of Americans cite money as a significant source of stress. Meanwhile, a 2023 study from Harvard Medical School found direct correlations between neoliberal economic policies and increased rates of mental health disorders across populations. These aren't individual failings, these are systemic outcomes. What I'm about to share with you is how one man's economic theories, specifically those of Milton Friedman, fundamentally reshaped not just our economy, but our entire understanding of responsibility, success, and failure. Friedman didn't just change how markets work, he changed how you think about yourself. He created a psychological framework that makes you the problem in every equation, ensuring you'll never look up to see the real mechanisms controlling your life. I'm going to walk you through 8 specific mechanisms by which this system operates, 8 ways that Friedman's ideology transformed from economic theory into a tool of psychological control. By the end of this analysis, you'll understand exactly how the system tells you you're the problem so you don't see the real solution. More importantly, you'll know how to break free from this mental prison and start addressing the actual causes of your struggles. Let me start with the first mechanism, the individualization of systemic failures. Milton Friedman built his entire economic philosophy on the premise that individuals, given freedom of choice in the marketplace, would naturally create optimal outcomes for everyone. He called this the invisible hand of the market. His theory suggested that if people were free to choose, free to compete, and free to succeed or fail based on their own merit, society would automatically organize itself in the most efficient and beneficial way possible. But here's what Friedman's theory actually accomplished. It created a psychological framework where every negative outcome in your life becomes evidence of your personal inadequacy rather than evidence of systemic dysfunction. When you can't afford health care, the system tells you you're not working hard enough. When you can't buy a house, the system tells you you're not managing your money properly. When you're struggling with mental health, the system tells you you're not resilient enough. The research from Stanford's Center for Social Innovation shows that countries with stronger social safety nets have significantly lower rates of anxiety and depression, even when controlling for income levels. Yet Friedman's disciples systematically dismantled these safety nets, arguing they created dependency and moral hazard. What they actually created was a population of people who blame themselves for structural inequalities. Think about your own life. When was the last time you struggled with something and your first instinct wasn't to ask, "What am I doing wrong?" When was the last time you felt financially stressed and thought, "This is a systemic problem rather than I need to work harder"? This isn't natural human psychology. This is trained behavior. You've been conditioned to turn criticism inward instead of outward. The second mechanism is the transformation of citizens into consumers. Friedman argued that the role of government should be minimized because markets could provide better outcomes through consumer choice. He promoted the idea that voting with your wallet was more democratic than voting with your ballot. This sounds empowering, but it's actually a form of psychological manipulation that shifts responsibility from institutions to individuals. When you're a citizen, you have rights. When you're a consumer, you have choices. But here's the crucial difference. Rights are guaranteed regardless of your purchasing power, while choices are limited by your economic resources. By reframing civic participation as market participation, Friedman's ideology transformed systemic failures into personal purchasing decisions. Can't afford college, you chose poorly. Can't access quality health care. You didn't shop around enough, living paycheck to paycheck. You're not maximizing your consumer choices. The system has taught you to evaluate every aspect of your life through the lens of individual consumer behavior rather than collective institutional responsibility. A 2020 study from the University of Chicago found that people in countries with stronger public services report higher levels of life satisfaction and lower levels of chronic stress, even when their individual consumer choices are more limited. Yet you've been trained to see limitations on consumer choice as threats to your freedom, even when those limitations would actually improve your well-being. Consider how exhausting it is to be constantly responsible for optimizing every decision. You don't just need shelter, you need to research mortgage rates, compare neighborhoods, analyze property values, and compete with investors for housing. You don't just need health care, you need to compare insurance plans, understand deductibles, negotiate with providers, and fight claim denials. This isn't freedom, it's the privatization of stress. The third mechanism is the weaponization of competition. Friedman believed that competition was the natural state of human interaction and that it would drive innovation, efficiency, and prosperity. He argued that competitive markets would reward merit and punish incompetence, creating a natural hierarchy based on capability and effort. This theory sounds reasonable until you examine what it actually does to human psychology. Competition, when it becomes the organizing principle of society, transforms every human relationship into a potential threat. Your co-workers become competitors for promotions. Your neighbors become competitors for property values. Your friends become competitors for social status. Even your family members become competitors for resources and attention. Research from the University of Rochester shows that societies with higher levels of economic competition have significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and social isolation. The constant pressure to outperform others activates the same stress responses as physical threats, flooding your system with cortisol and adrenaline on a chronic basis. But here's the psychological trap. When you're exhausted from constant competition, the system tells you that you're not competitive enough. When you're stressed from trying to outperform everyone around you, the system tells you that you lack the mental toughness to succeed. When you're isolated because you can't trust potential competitors, the system tells you that you need to work on your networking skills. The reality is that humans are naturally cooperative creatures. We evolved in small groups where mutual aid and collective problem solving were essential for survival. Friedman's competitive model contradicts our fundamental psychology, creating chronic stress and then blaming us for our inability to thrive in an environment that's actively harmful to our well-being. Think about how this plays out in your daily life. You're competing for jobs in a market where wages have stagnated for decades. You're competing for housing in a market where investment firms buy properties with cash. You're competing for health care in a system designed to maximize profits rather than outcomes. When you struggle in these rigged competitions, the system tells you that you're not trying hard enough. The fourth mechanism is the monetization of basic needs. Friedman argued that market mechanisms could efficiently allocate resources for all human needs, including education, health care, housing, and even social services. He promoted voucher systems, privatization, and market-based solutions to replace government provision of basic services. This sounds like it would create more options and better outcomes, but it actually creates a system where your survival depends on your purchasing power. When basic needs become market commodities, your ability to live depends on your ability to pay. This creates a psychological state of chronic insecurity because your fundamental survival is always contingent on your economic performance. You can't relax, you can't take risks, you can't pursue meaningful work that doesn't pay well because your access to shelter, health care, and education depends on maximizing your income. Studies from the European Journal of Public Health show that countries with universal health care, free education, and strong housing policies have significantly lower rates of anxiety disorders and stress-related illnesses. When basic needs are guaranteed, people can focus on growth, creativity, and contribution rather than survival. But in a system where everything is monetized, psychological energy is constantly devoted to economic anxiety. You're not just worried about paying rent, you're worried about what happens if you get sick and can't pay rent. You're not just concerned about affording college, you're concerned about whether the debt will destroy your future financial security. This is an individual neurosis, it's rational response to systemic insecurity. The cruel irony is that when you're chronically stressed about money, you're less able to make good financial decisions. When you're worried about survival, you can't think strategically about prosperity. The system creates the conditions that make financial stress inevitable, then blames you for not managing your money better. Consider how much mental energy you spend on economic anxiety. How much time do you spend thinking about bills, debt, savings, and financial security? How much of your identity is tied to your economic productivity? How many life decisions do you make based on financial considerations rather than personal fulfillment? This isn't natural human behavior. This is the result of a system that has monetized your existence. The fifth mechanism is the illusion of meritocracy. Friedman's theories were built on the assumption that market outcomes reflect individual merit. He argued that in a free market, the most capable and hard-working people would naturally rise to the top, while those who failed to succeed were simply not contributing enough value. This created a psychological framework where economic outcomes become measures of moral worth. The meritocracy myth is particularly insidious because it contains just enough truth to seem plausible. Yes, individual effort matters. Yes, skills and capabilities influence outcomes. But research from economists like Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zucman shows that wealth concentration has more to do with inheritance, market manipulation, and systemic advantages than individual merit. When you believe that economic outcomes reflect moral worth, every struggle becomes a character judgment. If you're working multiple jobs and still can't afford basic necessities, the system tells you that you're not valuable enough. If you're highly educated but underemployed, the system tells you that you chose poorly. If you're successful but miserable, the system tells you that you're ungrateful. The psychological impact of this is devastating. Research from the American Journal of Community Psychology shows that people in highly unequal societies report lower levels of self-esteem, higher levels of shame, and greater social anxiety, even when their absolute living standards are high. The constant measurement of worth through economic outcomes creates a population of people who feel fundamentally inadequate. But here's what the meritocracy myth obscures: the game is rigged. The children of wealthy families attend better schools, have access to unpaid internships, receive family connections for job opportunities, and inherit capital that allows them to take risks. Meanwhile, the children of poor families work during school, graduate with debt, lack professional networks, and cannot afford to take unpaid positions that might lead to better opportunities. When you understand that success has more to do with starting position than individual effort, the psychological burden of economic struggle shifts from personal failure to systemic inequality. You stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what's wrong with this system. The sixth mechanism is the privatization of risk. Friedman advocated for the elimination of social insurance programs, arguing that individuals should be responsible for their own retirement, health care, and unemployment security. He promoted personal responsibility as a virtue and social solidarity as a vice. This sounds like it would create more freedom and self-reliance, but it actually transfers all the risks of economic life onto individual shoulders. When risk is privatized, every negative outcome becomes your fault. If you can't afford retirement, you didn't save enough. If you can't afford health care, you didn't plan properly. If you lose your job, you didn't make yourself indispensable. The system creates conditions of massive economic instability, then holds you personally responsible for protecting yourself against forces completely beyond your control. The psychological impact of privatized risk is chronic hypervigilance. You can't relax because you're constantly scanning for threats to your economic security. You can't take creative risks because you can't afford to fail. You can't prioritize relationships or personal growth because you're always focused on protection against economic catastrophe. Research from the Journal of Health Economics shows that countries with stronger social insurance systems have significantly lower rates of anxiety disorders, even when controlling for income levels. When people know that unemployment, illness, or economic downturns won't destroy their lives, they can focus on productivity and innovation rather than protection and survival. But in a system of privatized risk, your mental energy is constantly devoted to worst-case scenario planning. You're not just living your life, you're constantly preparing for economic disaster. You're not just making career decisions, you're calculating the risks of every choice. This isn't prudent planning, it's survival mode psychology. Think about how this affects your daily decisions. You stay in jobs you hate because you can't afford to lose health insurance. You don't start businesses because you can't afford to fail. You don't take time off because you can't afford to lose income. You don't have children because you can't afford the costs. These aren't personal choices, these are responses to systemic risk transfer. The seventh mechanism is the transformation of collective problems into individual solutions. Friedman's ideology promoted the idea that social problems could be solved through individual market choices rather than collective political action. He argued that government intervention was unnecessary because individual consumers and entrepreneurs would naturally create solutions to social problems through market mechanisms. This sounds empowering, but it's actually a form of psychological manipulation that makes you responsible for solving problems that require collective action. Climate change becomes a matter of individual carbon footprints rather than corporate regulation. Healthcare costs become a matter of individual lifestyle choices rather than system reform. Housing affordability becomes a matter of individual financial planning rather than policy intervention. When collective problems are framed as individual solutions, you're set up to fail. You can't solve climate change by changing your light bulbs. You can't solve healthcare costs by eating more vegetables. You can't solve housing affordability by skipping coffee. But when you fail to solve these problems individually, the system tells you that you're not committed enough to change. Research from the American Political Science Review shows that when people believe they can solve systemic problems through individual action, they're less likely to support collective solutions and more likely to experience guilt and anxiety when problems persist. The individualization of collective problems creates a population of people who feel constantly responsible for issues beyond their control. The psychological burden of this is enormous. You're not just responsible for your own well-being, you're responsible for solving social problems through your consumer choices. You're not just trying to live your life, you're trying to save the world through your purchasing decisions. This isn't empowerment, it's the privatization of social responsibility. Consider how exhausting it is to be constantly responsible for research and optimization. You don't just buy products, you research their environmental impact, labor practices, and social consequences. You don't just choose services, you evaluate their contribution to social problems. You don't just live your life, you constantly audit your choices for their broader implications. The eighth and final mechanism is the weaponization of shame. Friedman's theories created a psychological framework where economic struggle becomes evidence of moral failure. If markets are efficient and meritocratic, then poverty must be the result of laziness, poor choices, or inadequate effort. This transforms economic inequality from a systemic problem into a collection of individual moral failings. Shame is one of the most powerful psychological tools for social control because it doesn't require external enforcement. Once you internalize shame about your economic situation, you police yourself. You don't demand better wages because you feel like you don't deserve them. You don't seek help because you feel like you should be able to handle everything alone. You don't question the system because you feel like the problem is you. The American Psychological Association has documented the relationship between economic shame and mental health disorders. People who feel shame about their economic situation have higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide, even when controlling for actual income levels. The shame isn't just a byproduct of poverty, it's a tool that keeps people from challenging the conditions that create poverty. But here's what shame obscures: the system is designed to create winners and losers. Friedman's competitive markets require inequality to function. Someone has to be at the bottom for someone else to be at the top. The shame you feel about your economic situation isn't evidence of your inadequacy, it's evidence that you're human enough to internalize the system's messaging. When you understand that economic struggle is built into the system, the shame transforms into anger. When you realize that your personal battles are actually political battles, the isolation transforms into solidarity. When you see that your individual problems are actually collective problems, the self-criticism transforms into system criticism. Think about how shame has shaped your own relationship with money, work, and success. How many times have you felt embarrassed about your financial situation? How many times have you avoided social situations because you couldn't afford them? How many times have you felt like a failure because you couldn't achieve the lifestyle you were told you should want? Now let me synthesize these 8 mechanisms for you. First, the individualization of systemic failures makes you responsible for problems beyond your control. Second, the transformation of citizens into consumers makes you evaluate everything through purchasing power. Third, the weaponization of competition makes you treat other people as threats. Fourth, the monetization of basic needs makes your survival contingent on your economic performance. Fifth, the illusion of meritocracy makes your economic outcomes measures of moral worth. Sixth, the privatization of risk makes you responsible for protecting yourself against forces beyond your control. Seventh, the transformation of collective problems into individual solutions makes you responsible for solving social problems through consumer choices. Eighth, the weaponization of shame makes you police yourself for economic inadequacy. Here's the central contradiction of Friedman's system. It promises freedom but delivers control. It promises prosperity but delivers anxiety. It promises choice but delivers compulsion. It promises merit but delivers inherited advantage. It promises individual empowerment but delivers collective manipulation. The real solution isn't better individual choices, it's better collective systems. The real solution isn't more personal responsibility, it's more institutional accountability. The real solution isn't working harder within the system, it's working together to change the system. Your struggles are not evidence of your inadequacy, they're evidence of systemic dysfunction. Your anxiety is not a personal failing, it's a rational response to irrational conditions. Your exhaustion is not a character flaw, it's the predictable outcome of a system that demands infinite growth from finite humans. The first step toward freedom is recognizing that the system telling you you're the problem is itself the problem. The second step is connecting with others who understand this reality. The third step is working collectively to build alternatives that prioritize human well-being over economic efficiency. You are not the problem. You never were the problem. You are a human being trying to survive in a system designed to extract maximum value from your labor while minimizing investment in your well-being. Your struggles are not moral failings, they're systematic outcomes. Your pain is not individual pathology, it's collective trauma. The system tells you you're the problem, so you won't see the real solution. But now you know better. Now you can see clearly. Now you can stop fighting yourself and start fighting for yourself. The real solution isn't changing who you are, it's changing the system that tells you who you should be. Your liberation begins with this understanding. You are not broken. The system is broken. You are not inadequate. The system is inadequate. You are not the problem. The system is the problem. And problems can be solved when we work together to solve them.